Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. We have with us here this afternoon Brother Karl Gaspar and Dr. Jovito Carino, uh, who is the department chair of the USC Department of Philosophy. We decided to uh, record this conversation this afternoon because if you can remember, we had the first installment of the 10th anniversary conference of the USC Department of Philosophy, where Brother Karl was supposed to present his talk last Saturday. Unfortunately, we had some technical difficulties, and so Brother Karl wasn't able to join us live, but we pulled through with me reading his paper. And so, as an addendum to that paper reading, we decided to once again invite Brother Karl to this conversation so that he could respond personally to the questions that were posed or questions that were sent to us. Um, hopefully we could also have more questions later on with Dr. Carino with us, and we are hoping that this recorded conversation will show us the nuance of Brother Carl's intellectual generosity. Um, Okay, Brother Carl, the title. Good afternoon once again, Brother Carl. How are you?
Uh, I'm good. Thank you very much, Paulo. I'm really
Uh,
glad this is happening.
oh yes, we're glad too, and I hope Jovi is also doing fine.
Yeah, thank you, Sir Pao, for inviting me to uh, be part of this opportunity to talk to Brother Karl Gaspar and also to pursue questions left unanswered and unasked last Saturday.
Yeah.
And I hope we can really, as you said, cover and untap the nuances of Brother Carl's discourse, no, read by you in his absence last time.
Okay. Yes. Thank you, Jovi. So, Brother Carl, we hope that you're doing fine. I hope that the internet will cooperate this time. And in order to save time, maybe we could go straight to the questions. No, I'll start with a question from Mark Steven Pandan. Mark asks, is memory essentially produced by an act of the immaterial intellect, by an act of the material body, or both? I think he's asking a question based on classical philosophy, the distinction between mind and body, and whether the mind or what we refer to as memory is part of the immaterial mind. So, Brother Carl.
Okay, I'll respond. I must confess that my scientific understanding of the anatomy of the brain is quite limited, but I will respond to Mark's question as best as I can. And I would argue that both the immaterial intellect and the material body are so integrated with each other to produce thoughts that could last in a person's consciousness. So it is really very difficult to ascertain which of the two has the greatest role or the greater role. But if we are believers, faith believers that is, like the indigenous peoples, that our dreams, visions, imaginations are integrated in our thought patterns, then both that which is immaterial can be lodged into the material component of our being. And once more, as I think tried to explain as much as I can, this particular question is a reflection of the manner that we, from a Western perspective, can create the binary oppositions between two things. But as far as I can ascertain as an anthropologist, in the understanding of the patterns of thinking among some people, like our indigenous peoples, and I think some of us who are the descendants still have aspects of this, that it's really very difficult to fragment between the immaterial intellect and the material body because they are so integrated with each other.
Thank you, Brother Carl. That's excellently answered. Um, okay. Any thoughts on that, Doc Jovi? Anything that you want to add to that, or as a response to Brother Carl, or
Maybe I will just listen first, sir, to the responses of Brother Carl to the posted comments and questions last time. And then from there, we can just probably proceed with our own comments and
all
questions.
right? Okay, okay, that would be great. All right, thank you, Brother Carl, for the response. So, Mark, I hope that you find Brother Carl's response adequate. Otherwise, you'll just have to send him an email and clarify further. Uh, all right, Brother Carl. The next question is from Jim Lester Beleno, and Jim asks, excuse me. He says, in memory, history, forgetting, the French philosopher Paul Ricoeur talks about the appeased memory. He argues that a happy memory is an offshoot of just remembering and just forgetting. Just remembering and just forgetting. Because it is impossible to remember everything as well as to forget everything. From this, do you agree that memory is a dialectic of remembering and forgetting? Thank you, Brother Carl, from Jim.
Yeah. Thank you, Jim, for that question. To me, recurse appeased memory theory is really worth pursuing because indeed there are many memories, both happy and tragic, that are remembered for a lifetime. However, there are others, unless of course these are recorded and documented, that disappear from our memory. Indeed, the dialectic of remembering and forgetting are two sides of our human reality. The most important thing, however, is to hold on as much as we can to the important events shaping our lives, which we should always treasure and thus remember. This is why, especially today, of course, because of the possibilities of documentation, we can really underline the importance of documentations, which include the setting up of memorials, monuments, and material things that could help us to remember these events. But also, this is where a collective memory is so important because this is one way that a people, a nation, a tribe can safeguard the legacy of their ancestors. So, indeed, as human beings, we need to consider always this dialectic between trying as best as we can to remember the important events, the landmarks in our lives, especially if these provide us very important lessons and insights into how we can be a better humanity, and not forget the lessons gained through the centuries.
Thank you, Brother Carl. I just want to add to what you mentioned, and in a way, this is in relation to the first question, because in the first question, Mark asks about the relationship between the immaterial intellect and the material body. And when you responded to Jim's question about the dialectic between remembering and forgetting, you mentioned something about memorials and documentation, which I think are material manifestations of remembering or material representations of memory. So in that sense, memory then cannot only be associated with the immaterial intellect. But memory is also, if I gather your thoughts correctly, memory is also something visceral, something concrete, and it is expressed through uh, material objects like mementos or even the act itself of documentation. So in that sense, also we cannot trust intellect uh, solely, because we need, in a way, we need the extension of concrete objects. We need the aid of concrete objects in order for us to remember. Any thoughts on that, Brother Carl? Sorry for jumping in, but it was just an interesting
Yeah, yes, you're right,
moment.
Paulo. There certainly is wisdom in what you said, but I think the warning for us is this, that we should try our best not to move to either pole, no? One pole is to rely primarily on memory and on that which is visceral, all that is imagined, even if this is handed down from generation to generation. On the other hand, there is also the tendency to over rely on the material aspects of remembering, precisely because we no longer trust our intuition, our imagination, and our capacity to remember what is past. So my point really was to try to see where we can balance the two. And I'm an anthropologist, and of course our expertise rely very much on thick description of what can be documented, especially when we do ethnography. But even then, our field work relies very heavily, precisely because of the phenomenological aspect, on bracketing our own prejudices and biases to be able to really enter into the so-called native's point of view. And whether we like it or not, there are still peoples in this planet whose native point of view rely primarily on memory, because for one reason or another they never really reach a certain level of setting up the material culture that would embody in a very physical concrete manner the memories of their descendants. So in the end, yes, certainly we need archives, we need all kinds of documents that we can treasure and make sure to be in secured places. But we should not at the same time reject the voices of those who would rather or who continue to rely on their memory to help us recall that which is a treasure of the legacy handed down to us by our ancestors.
Thank you, Brother Carl. That actually reminds me of this Heideggerian insight that technology, and in this sense, in remembering through, uh, uh, you know, memorials and documentation, perhaps, and storytelling, which are in a way instances of techne, instances of our as humans ability to use technology. So that Heidegger insight has something to do with how technology is also human, a human expression. So anyway, Jovi raised his hand. So Doc Jovi,
Yeah,
uh,
I just would like to add something, sir, to a remark you shared moments ago,
yes,
uh, related with uh, the function or the role of immaterial intellect in remembering. I'm not sure if the person who asked it is coming from optimistic perspective. Uh, well, the belief or the acknowledgement that intellect is immaterial is something that belongs not only to St. Thomas, no, but practically to all medieval thinkers. No? But then, caution also must be made because St. Thomas himself believed that while intellect is immaterial, uh, its activity and its efficiency relies on something that is very material. Uh, that the function of the immaterial intellect, its activity, uh, cannot cannot be optimized unless there are material inputs coming from the outside, unless there are sensible inputs feeding this so-called immaterial intellect. In other words, uh, what Aquinas in fact is doing is to overcome that dichotomous reading that usually separates what is immaterial and what is material. I would like to emphasize this because when it comes to remembering, both of these elements, material and immaterial, come into play. We really cannot think of remembering or memorializing anything unless we involve both, the dynamics of materiality and the dynamics of the immateriality. That's all I have to say, sir.
thank you, Jovi. Well said. And I agree with you. It's refreshing that there's a possibility of interpreting or reading Aquinas in that way, which I totally endorse. So it's a kind of overcoming of that dichotomy between the material and the material. So thank you, Brother Kat. Do you want to respond to that, or should we go to the next question?
Just yeah, I mean that's okay. So can we go to the next one?
Okay, okay. All right. So the next question, Brother Carl, is from Mark Steven, but actually the same person who asked the first question. So from Mark Stephen Pandan once again. He asked, Immanuel Kant wrote in his Critique of Pure Reason that thoughts without content are empty, intuitions without concepts are blind. It is therefore just as necessary to make our concepts sensible, that is, to add to the object to them in intuition, as to make our intuitions intelligible, that is, to bring them under concepts. These two powers or capacities cannot exchange their functions. So he quoted Kant. What role does memory play in the necessary interplay between the senses and the intellect? If a person is forgetful, is it due to a privation of the senses, or in intellectual powers?
Thank you again, Mark, for your question. And in one of my correspondence to Paulo, and I have also discussed this with Ryan Mabolok of Ateneo, who's also very much well versed in philosophy. To them, I have both confessed my limitations in the field of philosophy. And I must say that what you quoted in terms of Kant's critique of pure reason was not in my review of literature when I was preparing for this paper. So in a way, I may not be able to really respond directly to your question, but I will make an effort again to argue with you based on the critique that I made regarding the dominance of Western philosophy in regard to the manner that philosophy is taught in most academic institutions in the world today, including our country. And this is a critique that, in fact, there are a number of philosophers who have already indicated their criticism of Kant's very Western point of view in relation to the whole question of memory and remembering. And I did bring this up a little bit in my paper under the section of the critique of Western philosophy. Because this critique indicates that the Kantian view of philosophy gave very little value to visions, dreams, imaginations, and intuitions, as there is a tendency to privilege too much reason and intellect and rationality. And again, I critiqued it from my own field of anthropology, indicating that from the perspective of native or indigenous peoples, and this we still know very much from the decolonial philosophical framework that I use as lens in my paper, and based on consciousness arising out of social scientists working among Native Americans, indigenous, and Latin American peoples, those working among the Maoris of New Zealand and the Aborigines in Australia, and hopefully a growing number of us here in Asia, that there is collectively today an insight that it is possible to have thoughts made up of images rather than content, and that intuitions are precisely intuitions because they are not conceptual. And from these people's perspective, are this but illusions or hallucinations? Well, they will argue that it is not, or they are not, based on their actual experiences when they, as indigenous communities, through their shamans or their wise peoples, decide on various realities and problems that they face, not from the perspective of empty thoughts and blind intuitions, but instead from their very deep insight into the wisdom that is gained through centuries and somehow still lodged in their memory. And that's why I basically indicated that memory serves as a bridge between senses and the intellect. And as to the last point you raised, if a person is forgetful, it could be due to the process of aging, because we all know that. And I myself am experiencing that now. Or because, as medical doctors or psychologists, psychiatrists would tell us, they are being affected by dementia, Alzheimer's, or whatever disease affect them.
Thank you, Brother Carl. Dr. Carino has a question or a comment. Yeah. Doc Jovi, you're muted. There.
I'm sorry po. I just would like to add a few remarks to what Brother Carl mentioned a while ago. I think uh, memory or remembering, especially in the context of the discourse of Brother Carl, is something that I consider as uh, a kind of critique to the Enlightenment kind of epistemology. In other words, it's remembering or memory is something that transcends uh, the classical or traditional epistemology that we know. As pointed out by Brother Karl, remembering or memory involves more than just an activity of thought, more than just concepts and ideas. In fact, it involves senses, it involves mysticism, it involves bodily experiences. So, in other words, we really cannot uh, uh, pin down the value of remembering and or memory through the lenses of Enlightenment epistemology. Uh, I am, of course, coming from not only from what Brother Carl said, but also from the readings of those who were critical of the predominance of Enlightenment epistemology. So that's all for now, Sir Pao and
Can I
Brother.
make a comment on that, Paulo?
Please,
Yeah.
Brother Carl.
Thank you very much, Juby, for that comment. You know, part I think of my limitation in this kind of a forum is where I need to distinguish between my role as a social scientist, specifically an anthropologist, and my interest also in theology, because I'm also a theologian. In fact, I teach theology in a number of seminaries. And I was very careful when I was preparing my paper to not mix this area, even as I know in many of my works, these have become now very, very interdisciplinary. But certainly, this is exactly what I said, as Juby indicated, that among some peoples in this planet who have not, for better or for worse, been very much influenced by the Enlightenment epistemology and have no qualms and don't have to apologize in order to assert their religious belief system. Certainly, there is a very strong adherence to this field of what we call mysticism and spirituality. And that's why when we speak about shamans or the wise people of tribal indigenous communities, chances are they also lead in rituals. And rituals, of course, are the ceremonies where they bridge the human reality to that which is the supernatural. That's why, in a way, in some cases, when we speak about Oriental philosophy, an indigenous inspired philosophy, there are very strong currents of mysticism and spirituality, because within the framework of the mind of the thinkers of these particular traditions, the world is so integrated. There is no division between human and divine, between the material and immaterial, between earth and beyond earth, and so on. And it's so natural for them to think, and from their thoughts to act in a way that which to us, influenced by enlightened epistemology, can appear to be, quote, superstitious, primitive, pagan, etc., which has been, of course, some of the abuses committed by colonial regimes, feeling superior, that their cultures and their knowledge systems are far better than those that they colonize. And this, I think, is one reason why I'm a bit passionate regarding really advancing as much as we can a review of how our content of our educational system, especially in matters related to social sciences, and of course in the field of philosophy and theology in seminaries, can become much more open to allowing these other perspectives to be taught, to be discussed, and for students to write papers about, because it will expand our view of humanity, and perchance it might lead us into a more rootedness of our own indigenous past.
Thank you, Brother Carl. Well said. But since the question raised by Mark is based on a quotation from Kant, and gathering from what you've said, Brother Carl, it reminds me of the fact that Kant did not. The problem with Kant, I believe, is that he did not pay too much attention to what I refer to as cultural normativities. And so he talks about reason as if reason is this, for lack of a better word, abstract, you know, reality or entity that doesn't have anything to do with, but the material world. But indeed, even Kant himself talks about sensibility, and so therefore, that idea of sensibility presupposes a material world. But he fails, I think, to actually mediate the two, apart from, of course, the fact that in his epistemology, they say that knowledge is a combination of sensibility and understanding. But there's, I think, too much emphasis on understanding and ideas. Later on, he says, don't do not presuppose sensibility because they are pure ideas like God, freedom, and immortality. But one of the criticisms leveled against him, like for example, one of his contemporaries, Haman, who talks about language, the relationship between language and thinking. He says that Kant did not pay attention to the role of language in thinking. And so I would take that as Kant's failure to pay attention to cultural, cultural realities or normativities that I think um, play a very radical role in the way we think. All right, so I'll stop there. Jovi again has a question. Jovi, or a
Uh,
comment?
it's not a question, sir, but a kind of a repartee to what you're saying. Uh, Part of the question raised by Mark Pandan earlier has something to do with forgetfulness or its causes. No? And apparently, if we go back to the question, it seems to suggest that if a person fails to remember, uh, it hints at a kind of a failure of thought or failure to think. But once again, in the context of the discourse of Brother Carl, he was uh, giving us a portrait of memory that far exceeds any concept or idea. In fact, uh, in his discourse and also in his book, which I have begun reading, uh, memory can be an architecture. Memory can be a texture of a fabric. Memory can be a topography of rivers. Memory can be text of a poem. In other words, in the context of Brother Carl's discourse, forgetfulness suggests not just failure of thought, but it can also include failure to be affected, failure to be good, or failure to see, or failure to be touched by these images, remnants, structures of memory. In other words, we've always been we've always identified with memory with what is past or what is bygone, without considering that memory. the genuine kind, the real kind, is something that transcends time. It's something that goes through time. And in that sense, that it's something that goes through, as we pointed out a while ago, uh, that uh, transcends or exceeds any epistemological categories.
Thank
Uh,
you, Joe.
Can I comment?
Yes, please, Brother Carl.
Yeah, thank you, Paolo. That's a very good point you raised, and I like Jovi's response to it too. Yes, indeed, language and related to language, which of course is the field of semiotics, semiology, and so on, are the symbols and the images through which, of course, language either can express or not. No, nonetheless, the lens, the lens that I also use in my paper, as I indicated, is this decoloniality. And as you recall, by reading the paper, decoloniality arose from the third world perspective, Latin American and now African, and then Native American, indigenous peoples, and so on, because of a clear understanding of the impact of colonial domination, including the imposition of language. Fortunately, in the Philippines, unlike Latin America, Spanish did not in the manner that it destroyed or killed many of our indigenous languages. But of course, English has taken over, and to a certain extent today, of course, and technology is part of it, social media and so on. English is becoming more and more dominant, and in fact, also as from the perspective of the Southern Islands, where Cebuano is the more dominant language, there is sometimes the reaction to the imposition of Tagalog as the main source of the Filipino language. Anyway, language, of course, is very important because, well, we know it's the carrier of thought, and it's the way by which we are able to put into some kind of a frame the ideas that constitute our memory. But once they are sort of encapsulated in a language that is foreign, that is not our own, something is lost because we know the expression, lost in translation. And that is why I think there has already been a growing consciousness, and I think part of the reason why in a number now of philosophical schools, there's really an attempt to teach it in Filipino, or allowing the professors to discuss it, whatever mother tongue is common to the students. But there's still so much more that we can pursue. But I understand, of course, that there are certain limitations because we certainly are not used to discussing theories, concepts, ideas in our own mother tongue, but we would rather do it in English, and that is partly, of course, because of our colonial tradition. But certainly it is there, no, that's another element that adds on to that critique of the whole impact of coloniality. And that is why certainly these two will need to be discussed somehow in what way we can maneuver through this rather problematic space, to take into consideration the givens already where we are as Filipinos in terms of our educational system, our medium of instruction, and yet not completely throwing to the wastebasket that which constitute our identity, you know. And in this sense, I, I know it's really quite a challenge because even as in theological institutes, that is a struggle. But at the same time, we're just so empowered and inspired because some people already are sort of paving the road, and it's not as if we're beginning from scratch.
Thank you, Brother Carl. Thank you for your responses. I'd just like to say also that I have a copy of your book, your latest book, and I have started to read it as well. And the book of Brother Carl is precisely on memory, remembrance, Handu Manan. I hope I pronounced that correctly, Brother Carl.
Yeah, that's
Uh,
correct.
It's published by Claration Communications Foundation. So grab a copy. uh, and I'd like to, on that note, I'd like to also mention that I guess the most compelling reason why we invited Brother Karl to partake in our anniversary conference, because of the insights that he presents in his book Handumanan, which is on remembrance. Um, uh, and before I read the next question, Brother Karl, just a quick comment, perhaps, to what Jovi said about memory as having a lasting effect, and that we should not simply relegate memory to the past, no, therefore, in other words, memory in that sense becomes a kind of forgetting. My take on it is that I think remembrance or memory has an impact on the present, more so the present than anything else. In as much as I suppose, in the context of what we read in Brother Carl's book and what we heard last Saturday, it has something to do with the concrete experience of injustice or oppression. And if I'm not mistaken, and of course, Brother Carl could elaborate on it further, the perhaps the strongest reason why he uses decoloniality as a kind of framework is precisely it's precisely because the coloniality discourse allows us to speak about or discuss oppression as a material experience, no, as a not only an experience of the past, but something that we are experiencing in the present. So in that context, memory plays a very radical, crucial role in what we are experiencing in the present. And of course, more specifically, our experience of oppression in the present. But not just us, it's also, more importantly, I think, the experience of oppression of other people, and in this case, indigenous people. So that's just a quick addition to the thoughts of Jovi earlier, and of course your thoughts also, Brother Carl. All right, so we move on to the next question. I think this is the last question. There are comments, and we're also going to read the comments, but this is last under the questions category. So this is from Mary Jane Gabatino Mendoza. So Mary Jane asks the question: the habitus shared by a community is far from the individual memories, but is maintained whether an individual loses personal memory or not. What can you say about the memory that is communal?
Thank you, Mary Jane, for that question. But can I just make a comment first to the comment that Paulo made before the question?
Sure, Brother Carl.
Certainly, the very conscious use of decoloniality as the framework that helped me uh, come up with a paper, which I thought was very important to try to really push what I wanted to bring up. And this is also why the book was written, Handumanan, is certainly from a very personal experience of having tried or at least made an effort to be part of this historical process of dealing with people's oppression and marginalization. In particular, what happened during the martial law regime, which certainly was the moment of my generation. And luckily, we were sort of the young people at that particular juncture of Philippine history, where we were challenged to really rethink our positions vis-a-vis Filipino society and the future of our people. And for better or for first into activism. And that period of our life, I think for many of us continue to be a major concern, because even until today, despite my advanced age and sometimes problems I have with my health, I try to maintain at least one field of solidarity work, namely with indigenous people, because until today, in many parts of the globe, and in particular here in Philippines, and much more specific here in Mindanao, the situation of our indigenous peoples continue to really be problematic. And as much as they are struggling for their basic rights and their self-determination, they really need as much solidarity they can from intellectuals, from the middle class, from church people, and so on and so forth. So certainly, I cannot separate myself from that particular personal perspective in dealing with memory. And that's why I began my paper by quoting Spinoza, which of course we know is echoed in many literature and so on and so forth. You know, this idea of, if we cannot learn the lessons of the past, we will be condemned to repeating the same mistake. And this is certainly true. And I also indicated that in my paper, right here in our own country, and Handumanan is a way to remind us about this, that it is not as if the Filipino people have not been wise enough and brave enough to advance movements of emancipation from whatever oppressed them, whether this were colonial regime or by the local elite. Even as today, there seems to be a little setback in this resistance movement for the emancipation of the poor and the marginalized in our country. Nonetheless, it is there. There are pockets in the academe, in media, in civil society, among grassroots that continue to hold alive the memory of our descendants who, way back since the beginning of the colonial regime until today, have not lost touch with that particular dream that we as a people can live freely and justly with each other. And in my book, there's a whole section there of the revolts staged by Filipinos across the islands long before the Philippine National Revolution. And thus, certainly, there is that particular element. And true enough, the past is the present. No, it's not as if the past can be relegated just behind us and memorialized and put in museums as artifacts. No, they are supposed to be sources of energy to continue us to dream of this kind of society. Despite the fact that there are setbacks every now and then, which is to be expected, because all over the world, it's not as if the Philippines is the only one that is now faced with populism and some kind of a setting back of democratic ideals. So certainly, I I have this interest in decoloniality because as theory, it really, I mean, if you study more about this, there's element of Karl Marx in it. There's element of critical theory in it. There's element of all these other philosophical thoughts, because it's not as if philosophy has also not been able to articulate these particular aspirations. But since it is also very much interested in praxis, that's why it says that versus post-colonialism, the coloniality did not arise from academic circles as post-colonialism did. But both still deal with images and symbols and languages as Orientalism of Said did. No? The only possible edge or advantage of decoloniality is that we as Filipinos can relate to it more based on both past and contemporary experiences. And this is precisely the main point of my response to Mary Jane in terms of her question, in terms of collective memory. Indeed, memory that is communal is most certainly a good antidote to forgetting the lessons of the past. If a people hold on to the memory of past events through which they gained insights on how they can live in peaceful coexistence with each other and with the rest of creation, there's greater guarantee that the leaders arising from such a community will honor such memory. But once a people begin to forget the collective lessons learned through the years, the same mistakes are committed again and again. It is as if every generation will have or will need to start again a process of building up their community, but with no moral guidelines from the past that could guide them. This is a case today of many countries, including us, the Philippines, and even look at the United States today, the so called most enlightened country in the world. In reference to civil rights movements, more than 100 years ago, there was already a major resistance from the black peoples. And one of the massacres resulting from this was the Tulsa one that happened in 1902. And it did for a while provide to curb some of the abuses, the racial abuses against the blacks. But if we are to look at how the American society has acted these past few years that needed something like the Black Lives Matter, one would think that there has been no major advancement of civil rights movement in the US as led by Martin Luther King. Because right now, there still is a lot of racial prejudice in the US, not just against blacks, but as we know now, against Asian Americans. In fact, right now, many political scientists in the States are really quite afraid there's a possibility of another civil war in the US given their political landscape. So these are but reflections of how humanity can so collectively forget or what or be convenient enough to just forget as they hold on to some of their own beliefs regarding their own orientation as to how society should be made up, and certainly if we can enhance this collective memory, the better that we are assured, no, that some of the authoritarian regimes and dictatorships of the past will not take place again, because whether they are led by colonial masters or our own native oligarchy and elite, they still have the same impact on the majority of the people. And that's why today, here in our country, there's really a major concern among some sectors regarding how our collective memory of the Marcos regime has sort of been thrown away with some of the things that have been happening since Duterte came to power.
Thank you, brother Carl. Jovi has a comment.
It's a question, sir. No?
All right.
Maybe it's the right time now to ask my own questions. No, considering
Perfect.
that we're almost near our closure. At any rate, my question has something to do with the remarks made by Brother Carl a while ago uh, concerning the coloniality. Uh, well, when we use that as a context, it seems that uh, whether we invoke language, memory, or even our identity, there will always be elements that we may consider as given. And at the same time, there may be some spaces left open for rethinking or recreation, so to speak, in other words. Or if you wish to use another term, translation, for example. My question is, given that tension between what is given and what can be rethought or created or translated, up to what extent can we, for example, accept or acknowledge those that are given, and up to what extent, likewise, can we recreate or rethink or translate the other elements of language or identity or memory?
Okay. I'm sure, Juby, you yourself will have thoughts on your own question, but this is as far as I can respond to you. In my paper, I did indicate that given some of the limitations of philosophy to deal with a complex thing like memory, no, this is where an interdisciplinary orientation is very much required, and specifically for philosophy, interfacing with psychology and anthropology might be very useful to sort of widen our grasp of what is there. Here is where literature and the arts might also come in handy. And precisely because memory, as Diderot already indicated, and many thinkers in this field, memory is best expressed in images rather than concepts that are encapsulated in words and so on. And as we know, images as captured in symbols are very rich. And cultures all over the world, whether they're Western or Eastern or advanced or not advanced, developed, developing, etc., have their way of imagining, of having images, of constructing symbols through which the perceivers, the audience, we looking at these symbols and these images can are so drawn because they do remind us about certain things that are important to us, and certainly we're also dealing with the whole area of emotions and intuition and imaginations, and which is why the whole field of culture is not something also that's just a luxury in every society. And the only problem, however, is when a particular country has a policy, and that policy then translates into budgeting and hiring people and building buildings. But their concept of culture is like the one of Imelda Marcos, where we jokingly said that she had this edifice complex, building folk art center, cultural center, etc., etc. Or what sometimes our cultural institutions are doing, which is to privilege elite cultural expressions that are not our own. Or if they are our own, they belong to the oligarchy and have very little meaning insofar as the majority of our people are in the countryside, in the farms, in the factories, and the markets, and so on, where most of our people are. And yet, at the same time, some of our media institutions that manage to win the attraction of the media, of the mass media, of the massa, through their teleserie and their comedic programs on TV, etc., entertain the masses, but look at what also happens. So, unless there are ways by which, again, we as a society can decide to bring these thoughts and concepts and ideas more into images and symbols that are able to help remind us again of some of the lessons of the past, then certainly that bridging that you speak of cannot happen, no? And that's why, as we know, even in academic circles, while we cannot move away from the divisions, no, of the different colleges and so on, there really has to be a greater way of providing occasions where these arts and sciences can so integrate with each other so that the strengths of one can further enrich the strengths of the other rather than the weakness of one further highlighting the limitation of the other. But that's a very tangential way of answering your question, no? It doesn't really hit it on directly, but that's as far as I can respond to that question.
That's adequate and clear, Brother Carl. Maraming salamat po.
Okay, thank you, Brother Carl. We have some comments from the audience. I will read them. I think they deserve to be read also. But before that, I'd like to also contribute my, well, maybe comment on the comments of Jovi and also Brother Carl. Earlier, I think it was Brother Carl who pointed out the what I understood, Brother Carl, as the normativity of memory. No, memory as a kind of normative resource, kind of a source for utopian, a kind of utopian vision. No, uh, in other words, for me, this is related to the critical import of remembering of memory, and in a way related to my comment earlier that what memory provides kind of uh, a critical reflection and praxis also of what is going on in the present, and so it becomes a critique of marginalization, a critique of oppression. Whereas marginalization of oppression is a kind of forgetting. And so by emphasizing once again the role of memory, we understand that it provides the possibility of rethinking an alternative situation, which is very much Adornoian, right? It's very similar to what Adorno is telling us about utopia uh, and of course coming from Ernst Bloch as well. Uh, but what memory perhaps in this context provides a kind of possibility of imagining a future uh, where that future is radically different from the present. And it's not about erasing memory. It's, as a matter of fact, it's on the contrary, we can only arrive at that kind of future when we go back to memory, when we remember. Um, and lastly, the comment on uh, the possible. I think this also comes from Adorno in his notes to literature. He does talk about the fact that literature plays a more important role, or actually, he says literature does a better job. You know, it does a better job in explaining reality. And so, in that context, Adorno emphasizes no, the practicality, no, or to put it another way, the artwork or literature uh, 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 in as much as the artwork plays a better job, sorry, does a better job in allowing us to understand reality, then the artwork therefore opens up, it paves the way for praxis, no, for possible praxis. And so and I think that's this, in a way, the spirit of what Brother Carl was sharing with us earlier. All right, so thank you for responding to the questions, Brother Carl. I'll read the comments now. There are four comments, and like I said, I think they
Can I
deserve.
can I first respond? Can
Sure,
I
sure.
first respond? Yeah, just one
By all
point.
means, Brother Carl.
Yeah,
Yes, yes.
yeah, indeed, Paulo, no, because it's very disturbing now that owing to technology comes in. with social media and the possibility that some people can use money and influence to control social media through trolls, we have seen how this gadget can be a tool to reimagining memory, to reconstruct a memory that certainly is false. And yet, because of circumstances, for example, like the audience might be young people and they are not provided information by their parents, nor the schools are providing any input in contemporary history, they believe more in the social media postings of these trolls rather than finding out where the accurate information is. And we've seen how that helped make Duterte win. And it is possible again that this will be a tactic to be used in the coming elections. In the same way that Trump in the US has tried also to reimagine what recently were some of the events unfolding in that landscape. And again, somehow using the tools of social media and other fora, including Fox News, that they are able to tell another story, which is exactly the opposite of what happened in reality, like the elections are stolen. So it's really a phenomenon that's very disturbing. And what is the antidote to that apart from banning social media, considering how much we need the internet connection now, like this webinar, this forum we're having now, which I think is only really advancing the suggestion that we must do as much as we can, never, or we must do as best as we can to counter in ways that are still possible within our means, no, but it's going to be uphill fight. It's just telling us that new scenarios are unfolding that will make things even more difficult for the future.
Well, just to quickly respond to that, Brother Carl, I actually totally agree with you. But the antidote, I suppose, is education. I think, and it's not just you. It's not just the humanities that can save us. The humanities need to, need to need to partner with the social sciences and the science and the natural sciences. Uh, for me, the way we handle the pandemic, that's not just philosophy. It's not just ethics. For example, it's this assemblage of of various disciplines. And so, but yeah, I agree with you that most people today would rely on quick, the quick social media posts, because of course they're easier to read. They're and therefore there's research is not required on the part of the reader, and so they just consume this information. But the problem, and I think this is what you're saying, the problem is that in the process they also um, lose that faculty of remembering or faculty of memory. Uh, all right, thank you, Brother Carl. I think we should read the comments now, and like I said, they deserve to be read. There are one, two, three, four, five comments rather. So the first comment is from Dr. Rochi Matienzo. And Brother Carl, you may respond to the comments if you want. Rochi says the paper is comprehensive. He's responding to the paper that was read last Saturday. It was comprehensive and in-depth. An in-depth reflection on remembering, focusing on historicity, colonization, and the ramifications of to both East and West's theophysical discourse, geographical philosophy of religion, in particular Christianity, intellectual racism, hegemony on gender, capital, power that leads to epistemic oppression of the expanse of action and recognition of indigenous epistemology and well-being, concept of time, and even even the paper even connects it to salvation. Truly a praxis. Well, he's referring to you now. You are a praxis scholar and a man of mission and spirituality. Someone that we need, someone whom we need today. That's the comment of Dr. Matienzo. Do you want to comment on that? Respond to that, Brother Carl?
Thank you very much. These are very generous comments. Thank you.
All right. The next comment is from Christian Zeus Zuazo. Uh, Christian says, true enough, an act of forgetting may not just simply affect the society at large, but also the human person in his individuality. It is in memory and remembering that we are able to emphasize the consciousness that we have as a subject and as a part of a community. Perhaps this act of remembering could somehow aid, if not reconcile, the seeming competition between the East and West. Indeed, Brother Karl, Gaspar was keen enough in addressing these issues that are too important to be missed. So, yes, I think a reaction to your paper. So, Brother Karl, if you want to respond.
Yeah, both the collective and the individual memory have their own particular importance. No, certainly each one of us we will have to find ways to continue holding on to the memory of our specific ancestors. No, because it does provide a certain level of personal integrity, and it helps builds up confidence and self-esteem, especially if I speak from myself. I mean, part of why I thought I was empowered and continued to be inspired by my activism was knowing that my grandfather was a katipunero, that my grandfather who owned land gave up that land, went up to the mountains, joined the guerrillas during the tail end of the Philippine National Revolution. And the memory of that, which I did not hear from him directly because I was just a little boy when we went on vacation to Capiz. But that sort of family legend, it's not just a legend, but it's a historical fact, has sort of given me some kind of an impetus, allowing me to feel that there is that connection. Also, I knew way back that my mother, when she was in Manila, growing up as a little girl into a young lady, was involved in the zarzuela. And this was the zarzuelas that had Filipino content, like the one of Atang de la Rama and Tolentino and so on. Knowing that also, when I was very interested already in theater, because I did work in theater, was again another sort of impetus to connect me to my mother's side in regard to that particular aspect. So there is that value insofar as being rooted in your own personal identity. And over and beyond, of course, the importance of collective memory.
Thank you, Brother Carl. The next comment is from Mar Floren de Vera. This is a one-liner. He says, nakakalungkot lang na ang bilis natin makalimot sa nakaraan. And in parentheses, he wrote martial law. So I think this has been addressed earlier already. Because Brother Carl already mentioned his take on the forgetfulness of what happened during martial law. So the next comment is from Prince Eric Gapo, and Eric says the paper presented cover the The paper presented, Brother Carl's paper, covers a vast expanse of topics ranging from epistemology to decolonization. The paper made me wonder about how remembering is ultimately influenced by the affects or the emotions. The possibility of the reclamation of pre-colonial identities can be manifested through the process of remembering an epistemic process. Brother Carl, if you have any comments on that.
Yeah, certainly, no. This actually, this field of memory and remembrance is not something of the mind, of the rational. It involves very much emotions, especially if memories are rooted in very happy or even tragic circumstances, so that if there are images or symbols that remind us of those particular events, easily we can cry or we can laugh, you know. I mean, you watch a film, and why is it that there are certain moments in watching a film that you just naturally allow your tears to flow? It's because something gets triggered, and that certainly is because something similar or an echo of that thing that unfolds on the screen happen in real life, and so it's the connect of the affect, you know. And precisely the power is there because when we speak about passion, when people make very passionate commitments, it's not only because of the brain, it's not only because of the mind. If that's only the workings of the intellect, well and good, but it's when people are impassioned for a particular cause that they're willing to offer their lives for whatever cause they believe in. So certainly, there is certainly that particular element of the emotion to it, that cannot be denied. What's the second aspect of the question? I forgot.
All right. Eric said the possibility of the reclamation of pre-colonial
Ah,
identities.
yes, yes, of course. Uh, in my book, that's one of the recurring themes. No, um, there is so much of the pre-colonial actually that is still there. We are just not conscious that they still exist even among us lowlanders, even in really urbanized centers. We know this. There are automatic things we do, no? Like we make the sign of the cross when we pass by a church, things like that. And in fact, especially among indigenous communities that remain intact, it's the pre-colonial consciousness that still determine decisions that they make. Even today, as we do field work, I know some indigenous communities whose decisions in planting and harvesting and rituals and so on are very much connected to their memory of how the stars in the heavens are formed and the flow of the wind, things like that. Although, of course, there's a bit of a difficulty owing to climate change because things are changing in their habitat. Nonetheless, they're holding on to it. Very interesting in the research that I did in writing the book. I found this article that referred. I think this was by Rizel Mojares, a book published in Ateneo Manila Press, where he spoke about Rizal trying his best to reclaim the pre-colonial values and actions of Filipinos long before the Spaniards came because he sort of romanticized that past, no? Unfortunately, he didn't have the time, neither the skill nor the experience to actually dwell on it. But he did a few writings on this, which I thought was very interesting. I picked that up, and it's in the book because it echoes that 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 particular aspiration that many of us may have, especially those of us who are in the field of arts and culture and even in anthropology, that we really need to revisit and reclaim as much as we can that which is still living in us, a legacy of our ancestors long before the Spaniards came.
Thank you, Brother Carl. And then we have our last comment from Jillian Marian Garcia. And Jillian, here's her comment. She says, historical upbringings behave like genes, inheriting colonial thinking, which embeds almost genetically in memory. Not that we are powerless from history. Uh, how we remember also shapes our memory. If only Brother Carl could have presented the paper, but I find the presentation still fruitful. Okay. She wanted that would have presented the paper yourself. So she's looking forward to this conversation that we're having. But if you want to comment, Brother Carl, on Jillian's
Yeah. Yeah,
uh,
sorry again
comment.
that the internet problems did not make it possible for me to appear online. I can tell you, I was so stressed that afternoon trying to connect, and it's one of those things that you really have no full control. But I'm just so glad that Paolo continued with the forum and read my paper, and certainly that was a very good way to respond to the emergency.
Mhm.
But certainly there's a whole world that I think still needs to be discovered by us, as I tried to explain, I even in this session. And you are right in saying that there are great possibilities, no, through which we will be able to move into these different paths. And we can only hope that both professors and students in philosophy might be open enough to providing all avenues through which some of these discourses can continue to take place. No? And I certainly would welcome other possibilities of such interaction.
Thank you, Brother Carl. Anything else that you want to add, Brother Carl, or maybe Jovi?
Are you
Uh,
still, uh, sorry, can
Go
I
ahead,
go?
Brother Carl.
Yeah. Are you still pursuing that thing with the 500th year memory thing that you were thinking of?
I think that's for you, Jovi.
Oh, okay.
I'm not sure, sir, if uh, what Brother Carl is referring to. I'm not sure if it's the same thing that you shared with me some weeks ago regarding the seminar on memory. Is that the same thing that Brother Carl is talking about?
Um, Brother Carl, I
Or,
think, yeah,
or
because we talk about the possibility of organizing a small seminar on memory. Uh, Probably this is already a kind of prelude to that.
yeah,
Uh, but yeah, maybe brother, if that is what you're asking, Brother Carl, we are still, of course, very much enthusiastic about organizing that mini seminar. Uh, so yeah.
and the context remains the 500 years of Christianity here in the Philippines.
Mhm.
In other words, it's a repackaged project. Instead of simply zeroing in on Christianity in the Philippines, it's really Christianity vis-a-vis the act of memory.
Yes.
Okay, that's
Um,
what I meant. Yes, that's what I referred to.
Yeah,
okay.
yeah,
Yes,
yeah.
Brother Carl. Yes.
It's still a
Lear-
go, Brother
but
Carl.
It's still.
but but learning from experience, maybe Paulo, this time we will record before the
Yes, of
actual
course.
day. If you
Yeah,
can
Yeah,
arrange that I
we
can
can.
be interviewed before and it's recorded, that's better. And
Yes.
I'll just catch up with the Q&A.
Yes, Brother Carl. As a matter of fact, we'll probably do that. Pre-record the conversation, because we are all right now slaves uh, to technology. Uh, um, I like I just like to pick up Brother Carl. Maybe just a last and before we close our session, I just would like to pick up on what Jillian mentioned about uh, um, remembering or historical upbringing, maybe culture. She's probably talking about culture as kind culture behaving like like parang genes, yung cultures rather behaving like genes, inheriting memory, colonial think, like for example, colonial thinking. Um, it's part. So in a way, parang in a culture, there's this genetic encoding of memory. Uh, so the way we remember is also informed by that code that we inherited. Um, so, do you have any last thoughts on that? It's just for me a very interesting point.
Yeah, I yes. Unfortunately, my background in the study of DNA is very limited. No, recently I had a very interesting forum where I was invited, where a Filipino scholar in from the University of Sweden presented his theory, his migration theory on the peopling of the Philippines, using the DNA as the framework of proving where our ancestors came from. And it was very interesting, very, very interesting. And in fact, the paper is going to change many of the contemporary theories on migration to Southeast Asia, including the Philippines. And that's when I realized that DNA has so much possibility beyond the forensic investigation and so on and so forth. No? So certainly it is an area that can be further pursued, and that's why I did not make any comment, because it will only reveal my ignorance in this particular field. But just as a hunch, there must be a way by which pursuing this particular field of relating DNA to memory can go beyond some of the areas where DNA studies are already involved in, namely looking at the particles of our chemical composition and so on that will determine our races, or and so on, and diseases in our body, all the scientific sort of aspects of it. But I've always been struck by this particular idea. I cannot even recall now exactly where I picked it up in some of my readings. But this author was saying that every cell of our body has its own identity, has its own peculiarity, and in a way that every cell in our body has its own memory. In other words, if we are constituted by what, thousands, millions of DNAs in our body as they came from our parents and way, way back our grandparents and so on and so forth. And if this thought has any value, then certainly the DNA, beyond the scientific composition of chemicals and so on, may also contain these immaterial elements of memory, because where do our DNA come from, or that which is constitutive of our human body? Aren't they from our parents? And the ones of our parents, aren't they from our grandparents? And that of our grandparents, way, 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 way back, and you duplicate that thousands of years, and it goes all the way back to our ancestors in Africa, who moved across Asia and ultimately to Southeast Asian islands. So as this move through space and time, is it possible that there are things there that are embodied, that which we still have not been able to discover. Because it's also said that what percentage of our brain are we able to take advantage of? Is it 10% only or even more? Which is saying that there are some people in this world who, because they're able to use more of their brain, they become shamans or they become people of great wisdom, which maybe means that something there in their DNA makes them that compared to other people. So these are just hunches, but it's very interesting that the literature already is pursuing all of this what if. And I don't know how much of this particular paths of learning philosophy is interested to pursue. But certainly DNA is a field that uh, demands more investment in research and study.
Thank you, Brother Carl. I'm also not. I wouldn't say that I know anything about the scientific details of DNA, but uh, I think as a kind of philosophical explanatory trope, DNA, genes, in as much as they have something to do with the transfer of memory, they could, I think, be used as a kind of explanatory trope, when we are explaining how culture develops, and how we inherit, you know, uh, uh, our values and our belief systems and so on. All right. So, do you, anything else, Brother Carl or Jovi? Do you want to add anything else to our conversation?
I just would like at this point, sir, to once again thank Brother Carl for his generosity, for his presence, for his contribution not just to our conference, no, but practically to the uh, Philippine, let's say, intellectual culture. What he has done in the past and continues to do until now will definitely enrich our academic discourse, our researches, and the way we practice philosophy. For that, maraming salamat po, Brother Carl.
Thank you,
Yes,
Judy. Thank
I,
you very
I
much.
second Jovi's appreciation of Brother Carl's intellectual generosity. I think that we need more people like you, Brother Carl. And again, thank you very much for agreeing to have this recorded conversation. We're going to share this with those who attended the conference and also those who are interested in the topic that you presented. And once again, hopefully, we would do something similar with the planned um, seminar on memory. So this is just perhaps a prelude to that. With that, maybe we already closed the conversation, and I hope that uh, the both of you will stay safe and healthy. So thank you very much for spending time with me this afternoon.
Okay. Thank you too, Sir Pao. Maraming salamat po.
Thank you,
Thank you very
Paolo. Thank you
much.
very much.
Thank you, Brother Carl.
Uh,
Thank you, Brother Carl. Thank you, Jovi.
We'll be in touch. Bye bye.
Yes. Bye bye.